Hi there, welcome to Muse to Go. My name is Carrie and I'm going to be your instructor for today. We are going to be working on our Buzzing Blossoms painting for today's lesson with some mixed media incorporated into the background. You can see we have some cool little pieces of this painting where our paint is actually going to peek through to that newspaper. And I'm excited to show you some techniques on how to get this mixed media feel on one of your standard canvases. So make sure that you have your Muse to Go kit all prepped and ready to go. You have a good work surface ready to get started on your project. I'm also going to need you to grab 2 sheets of newspaper and something to adhere the newspaper onto the canvas. So you can use a gel medium that's clear. You can use Mod Podge. You can also use a little bit of glue. Whatever you have laying around, feel free to grab those supplies and we're going to lead you step by step through today's painting. Let's get started. Now we're all set up and ready to go. So I have my newspapers, I have my canvas ready to go. I'm going to get out my medium-sized brush to be working with as well. And then you're going to want to get out your whatever you're using to adhere the newspaper to the canvas. So again, I'm going to be using the acrylic gloss medium. You can use Mod Podge or you can even use glue in a pinch. But what we're going to do to start out is we're going to start by tearing some sheets of our newspaper. So just as a reminder, with kind of the final effect of the design, like what I'm really going for is I want to get lots of little strips as I'm working. So the biggest thing is that you want to be able to have different sizes to work with. So don't be afraid or trying to rip everything the same size. Really, it's okay to have a good mixture, and that's even better in the long run. Now once I got my nice little pile of newspaper, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start in the middle with kind of a bigger piece of paper, and I'm also going to take my medium brush and I'm going to get some of this clear gel medium on the end of it. So you don't need too much, but what we're hoping to do is we want to start to coat kind of a broad area in the middle. Now this is just like acrylic paint. This is gonna start to dry as you go, so don't wait too long. Don't try to paint in your whole surface, because by the time you get up to those corners, guarantee it's gonna be dry. So that should be a good enough surface for what I'm working with my newspaper. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna lay it flat on there, and I'm just gonna use my finger to smooth it out just a little bit. And then we'll take some more gel medium and we're going to apply it right to the top as kind of a sealant coat. You'll see this technique a lot with decoupaging, where you'll take like newspapers, or sometimes people will take magazines and kind of make a cool design like onto furniture, or I've done it to a desktop before, which is really cool. The trick is that you want to work in small areas and you want to work with like thin coats of gel medium. So working quickly is really going to help you a lot here when you're working on individual pieces, so that it doesn't dry in between. I'm going to start on my next little area up in this top corner, and I'm just going to start by applying the gel medium right to the top. And then I'm going to take my newspaper. And I'm going to overlap it with what's happening with the first piece. You can see I put it in a different direction. Can be upside down, could be completely the opposite way, whatever you guys want to do. I like to have it kind of mismatched every single time I put it down, so that I guaranteed have an uneven kind of sporadic design that'll work really, really well for our final product. Let's take some more gel medium and we're just going to place that right on the very top at a nice thin coat. Then we'll take our next piece and we'll keep working. I'm going to head towards this size, and again, I'm just going to be overlapping a little bit with my previous pieces of paper. So I want to make sure I lay down enough gel medium that's fresh for anything that I might need. Make sure I cover that spot. And then I'm going to brush a little bit of the excess that I have on my brush before taking more of the gel medium. Perfect. So we're going to keep doing this technique and we're going to go through the entire rest of your back panel. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Now when I do get to one of the edges, like I just did here, I'm going to wrap it just like I would if it were paint. That way I don't have to worry about tearing or cutting my paper to the perfect length. I'm just going to add a little bit of gel medium to this edge and then a little bit to the back. And to keep my hands from getting too sticky, I'm actually going to take my brush and just fold it right over the edge. Perfect. Once you've finished and you have your entire surface covered with newspaper and your edges nicely wrapped, we're going to go on ahead and put the Mod Podge away, or the gel medium or the glue, whatever you're using. Go ahead and seal it up. And then make sure that you really rinse out this medium brush that you were using. Any glue that stays left in the fibers of your brush is really going to be harmful to the brush in the long run if it dries out. So you're really going to want to give it a very good swish in your water, and it wouldn't even hurt to go through and give it an extra rinse with some soap and water by one of your sinks. Otherwise, you're going to wait for your background to be completely dry before you get started on the next step. Now that our surface is all dry and ready to go, we are ready to start with our first step on our painting. Now, what is really special about having such a dynamic background to start out with is we really can let the newspaper sort of peep through in some of the elements of our final design. So if I bring this up close, you can kind of see through the bumblebees. We can actually see some of the words peeking through, as well as some parts of the flowers. And it's just such a neat way to incorporate this mixed media effect into your overall design. So throughout our mixing for today, we might mix up a color and then I'll have you add a little bit of water to it. Water is going to be your best friend for today's class. It's really going to be helpful for you to be working with your canvas flat on the table instead of propped up on an easel or up against anything else to keep it more upright. So what I'm going to start with first on this design is I really want to start with our flower shapes. Truly, that's going to ground everything in the entire painting and kind of let us know where we need to place our stems and where we need to fill up the rest of our canvas with some of the bumblebees. So go ahead and get out your largest brush and we're going to mix up a color. Now, what I want to do is I want to get kind of not the very darkest shade, but kind of this medium shade of our pink color. You can feel free to customize this however you want, but that's going to be our base color that we're going to use to lay down our shapes for today. So what I always like to do is I always like to start out with a little bit of that white paint. So what I'm going to do first is take one half scoop of the white paint, just a very little bit. And let's take a whole scoop of the red paint and we'll mix that together. Now try to keep it in a nice tight little pile. You don't want to spread your paint all over your palette if you can help it. And you can see already I have a really nice pink shade that's starting to pop up. So I'm going to go ahead and use this for my first color. The nice thing about these flowers is they're really abstract. Sometimes that can be hard to grapple with because we're not working with specific areas of the flower. But today with these elements, you can see we have specific areas that we're going to end up lighting up and making a little bit darker. So the abstract is going to work great. We really want to be able to see those brush strokes pop through as we work. So go ahead and kind of scrape off a little bit of that mixed paint on your brush. What we want to do is go ahead and rinse out your brush. We want to start with a little bit more of a wet brush so we can control how much paint is going to go on it and build it up with the layers as we go. You can always make it thicker with the newspaper. It's a little bit harder to remove it away with this type of background technique. So with my brush pretty wet still, I'm just going to go in from the side of my paint. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this flower right here, and I'm going to go through and add in some of my flower shape. So going ahead and just apply in a circular fashion. We're really not going for like a perfect shape just yet. I want to keep it so that it would still fit easily in the palm of my hand. You don't want to be more than a couple inches wide. And you can see I really have that beautiful translucent color that's happening, so I can see my background peek through. So I'm careful not to get too close to the bottom of my canvas because I do want to leave a little bit of room with this stem, but where that's our smallest flower, that should be perfect to get started with. I'm going to go back into my paint. If you feel like your brush is starting to get thick, the more that you reload it, feel free to give it a completely fresh rinse in your jar of water, and then you can come back. But I'm going to make sure I have at least a finger's width of space for my next flower on that top left. I'm going to do a little dot, as you can see. And then I'm going to get a little closer to the canvas and a little bit further to the top. This is not so much a circle shape as it is more of an oval shape. And we're going to go about 1 inch up. I'm just going to pull that paint in from either side. So this time it's less of a circular brush stroke and I'm more just pulling in that paint from the top and giving it a little bit more of a rough edge. Beautiful. The last flower over on the right hand side, again, we have about a finger's width of space from the bottom of the flower to kind of where our first flower started. So you can use that as an easy marker. You can even give yourself a little bit more space if you're not sure. And this is also kind of an oval shape. So I might start out with however long I want my flower to be again. And then once I want to start building in the top, about 1 inch up, I'm going to start to pull my brush in from the top, just really pointing that brush away from that first curve of the flower and bringing it towards the bottom. Gentle pressure is great for something like this. You really don't need to press too hard. And where we're working on the table, it actually is going to make it easier to make more gentle pressure because you can see I can rest my hand directly on the newspaper or directly on the table and really just use a nice feathery touch as I work. All right, perfect. So we're going to go on ahead and rinse out our brush. We're going to use the same brush again. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of my white paint. I'm going to move it off to the side, and with my damp brush, I'm just going to be adding in a little bit of water. Now this is going to be too stark white if I just apply this directly for the highlights of my flower. So I do want to take a little bit of my first color and mix it in. It doesn't need to be the exact shade that you want it to be right now because it will mix in a little bit with our background color. But we do want to get it pretty close to the way there. All right, again, scrape off your brush a little bit. You can feel free to give it a little bit of a rinse because we do have, even with the water, have a decent amount of paint on our brush. And I'm going to pull up that paint and I'm going to add in some highlights. This is not going to go more than halfway down the flower on the top left. I really want to save this bottom kind of half for our darker color that we're going to add in next. So go ahead and just gently pull in from the top and add in some of that color. Now, what's really important with a step like this is you do not want to have your brush with too much paint on it to get started with, and we don't want to press too many times on top of the flower. Really what's going to give that petal effect and make it look like you have those individual shapes is by not brushing too many times over top. If I brush too many times over top, what's going to happen is it's just going to mix in with my background color and it will be very pretty, but it will not be the effect that we're going for. Grabbing a little bit more paint, a little bit more water, and I'm going to do the same thing on this other side for this right-hand flower. I'm starting at the top of the flower and I'm moving my brush. Again, I don't want to go below halfway. I really want to keep that curved shape so it really has that effect of a flower. It's okay to have a little bit of darkness at the top. You don't need to totally cover that up. It's actually a pretty effect that'll make it look like your flower has a little bit of depth. And you can feel free to play with this a little bit if you want to go back to your first color a little bit and kind of blend in or touch up any of your edges in between. That can be really nice as well. But again, remember, you don't want to use too much paint because part of what makes this mixed media so beautiful is being able to see the newspaper in the background. And being able to see the newspaper is most effective when we don't use a lot of paint. All right, for my last flower, I'm going to take my little paint mixture and I'm going to take a little bit more of my pink. I'm going to add it so that I'm darkening up this white just a little bit more. And then I'm going to go through on this top left-hand side of the flower, and I'm just going to pull in a little bit of this shade. It's okay to go outside of your lines. It's okay not to completely cover up that line. We really just want to continue to keep that curve effect and point your brush towards the outside. All right, let's rinse out that brush right there. You can add a little bit of the water to your brush still after you rinse. Just kind of tap it off on the side of your jar or can. And I'm going to take a little bit of the red paint off to the side. And I'm going to mix that water in so you can see when I push it around, I can really see through the bottom of my palette pretty easily. And we're going to add some low lights, so some darker parts of the flower. I'm going to start again up on that top right. And this time I'm going to pull in kind of into this, what I imagine the center of the flower would be. So I'm still pulling in that same direction so that I get that effect of my flower petals moving through. Feel free to add a little bit more red and water as needed. And then I'm going to go ahead and move on to my next flower. So I'm going to do this same effect, pulling in the same direction for my right-hand flower right here. And then for my bottom flower, I'm just going to pull in a couple of my brush strokes, pulling out from the center. And I'm going to go through and just feather the edge of the top of this flower just a little bit more. It was feeling a little too uniform. So I'm going back to my original pink color that we mixed, that first color. And I'm just going to tweak this little area right here. Then I'll go back to a little bit of that red and add it mostly to the side and to the very bottom. But truly, if your flowers are looking a little bit like blobs, that's kind of what we're going for right now. It's really the stems, the center of the flower that's going to start to pull together these shapes. The actual petals are pretty abstract. So if you're feeling like they're not quite blended together how you'd like, feel free to give them a little bit of a rest. You can always come back to that part of your painting and do some more finessing later on. Once you're happy, we're gonna rinse out our brush, and then you're going to go on ahead and grab your medium brush, and we're gonna mix up a color for our stems. Now I really want to go and get this dark green color next. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my mixing palette and find another free space. I'm going to go and take a scoop of the yellow. I'm also going to take a scoop of the green. And I'm going to take about a half a scoop of black paint, and we're going to start by mixing those colors together. Now already this is getting us to a really pretty green shade. I'm going to add a little bit more black to this because I want to darken it up a little bit more. The yellow is really good because it helps us get a more vibrant color. The green, of course, is what's getting us a very green color, and the black is going to get us that tone that really looks like those dark green stems like what we had from before. So you can see I have a really, really pretty color here. And I'm going to use this for our next step. So go ahead and scrape off any excess paint on your brush. We're going to actually put that back in your can of water and grab your smallest brush, and we're going to use that to apply some of our stems. I'm going to work on the stems first, and then we're going to slowly build up each of the stems, and then we're going to build up the bottom of the stem where it connects into the flower petals. And then I'll show you guys how to build off of these to make kind of teardrop shapes or little leaf shapes that pop up off of the side. The most important thing is to kind of just keep in mind your individual paintings here. If you feel like there's an area that's getting too crowded on your painting and you want to leave out one of these extra stems, feel free to kind of choose your own adventure and customize this however you want. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up a little bit of water and kind of twist my brush so that it gets a really nice point on it. I don't want to drag my paint too far out, but you can see what I've added the water to on the side is significantly thinner than kind of what we started with. I'm also going to hold this brush pretty close to the top end, so really make sure you have a lot of control. You can also, as long as it's clean, rest your pinky or rest your hand on your canvas or on the table. And what I would love to do first is start with our first stem right over here. So bottom of the flower of this first flower that we made, it's not going to be completely straight, but it's also not really that curved. So good news, if you have a little bit of a wobbly hand, you're in luck. So I'm going to draw that right to the bottom of my canvas and then kind of smooth out my paint just a little bit. The next shape that I'm going to do is going to be this one on the right that kind of curves from the bottom of the flower and down to the bottom of our canvas, close to the middle. Nice gentle pressure. I'm going to add a little bit more water to my brush, and then we're going to do the same thing to the very last stem. So this one, you can see it's going to start right at the almost the middle of the back of the flower that we have pictured. And then it's going to skip underneath of this middle flower and then finish off the bottom of the page. So I think the most important thing for me is that we're really starting kind of in that center part of the flower. And we're stopping once we get to bumping into this middle flower right here. You can kind of take your brush and just skip over the top a little bit and give yourself a little dot on where it would end. And then you can continue down and off the very bottom of the page. Feel free to, as you go, anytime you touch like the edge of your canvas, just like we did before with the newspaper, if you want to paint down a little bit, you can. We don't have really thick edges with these canvas boards, but what I tend to notice when this is hanging or if you frame it once you're done is this little corner right here. So I would make sure that you just touch up that little corner and you should be good to go. So I'm going to widen out some of these stems. This one on the side is pretty easy. I'm just going to create another line coming in from the very bottom of my flower. And I'm going to curve it into my stem. So it's getting a little bit wider at this part, which is totally okay. I want to fill it in a little bit. And then I'll extend that line a little bit further on either side, just kind of outlining the bottom of the flower. You can see I'm using kind of short brush strokes here. That's going to help give it a more stem-like effect. instead of using a lot of smooth strokes. That also helps me control my shape a little bit as well. Now I'm gonna go ahead and grab a little bit more paint for this next part. Not too much, I still wanna have a little bit of that translucent effect, but I'm gonna reload and then go into this top left flower, pressing my brush in kind of its own little flower shape. So again, I'm using the top of the brush and I am going through and pressing down that shape and guiding it back into my stem. These can be kind of rounded. They don't need to be perfectly shaped on the edge. I do want to kind of cover up with a little bit thicker of paint where my original line was, so that really what we're focusing on is the underside of the petal and not having too much of our initial line distracting us by showing through. We really don't see it on this one because it connects really easily to the bottom of the flower, but where this is the base, we really want to give the illusion that we painted this whole thing all at the same time. Adding a little bit more water to my paint to refresh it a little bit. And I'm gonna add 2 more stems. These are really fun. They kind of lean out almost like candy canes a little bit. So what I'm gonna do for this first one, I really wanna start with this one the furthest over, because I know that if I make this far enough over, I'll really have plenty of room in between to add my next one. So for this flower right here, I know that I'm gonna be reaching towards the corner of the page almost. I'm going to be starting down right at the bottom. And for me, I like to break it up into 2 steps. I'm going to have the first arch start in the middle and guide it down. And then for the second arch, I'm going to end right around here. So I'm going to gently glide my brush. Beautiful. And then you can go through and you can add the top of your teardrop shape. So I'm not adding this directly to the bottom. I'm going upwards a little bit. I'm just adding 2 little parentheses to either side and filling it in. I'm not worried about creating a perfectly smooth, it's not too crooked, but it doesn't need to be perfectly flat here. We want to keep those abstract kind of organic shapes like what we did with our flower petals, because it'll make the whole painting sing a little bit better together at the end. All right, and we can repeat that step with the next flower. This one is actually going to end all the way over on this side. The final step is to add any leaves that you might like to the stems. There's not really a particular number that we're shooting for. Mostly what this is used for in our design is to fill up any areas of the painting that might be missing something. So for instance, you might add a flower petal leaf right up at the top here. Maybe you add one in the side where it's a little bit more empty. We could add one towards the bottom where we don't have anything right now, and to kind of fill up this outside space and a little bit of the space in between. So just like when we added the back of our stem into our flower up top over here for our top left flower, for this shape, really what we're going to do is we're going to be taking the edge of your brush and we're going to be dragging it, starting really, really light pressure with the top of your brush. And as I get closer to the stem, I'm going to flatten my brush and guide it in to get a really nice leaf shape. And I'm going to go ahead and add some leaves in using that same technique to the rest of my painting. Something that really helps me a lot is sometimes I'll move my painting around just to get that exact right angle. Do be careful not to rest your hand into any of the wet paint that we just painted on where we're working on the table. Otherwise, have fun, and you can add just as many as me, or you can skip a few if you feel like it gets too crowded, or add even more. For our next step, we're gonna mix up a couple of colors. We're gonna mix up this color for our bumblebee, and we're also going to mix up for the body and for the wings. So what I want to do is I'm going to start with the orange color. We're going to start with much more yellow than the red. So you can see I have a good size scoop here. I'm going to lay it off to the side, and I'm really just going to try and dip just the corner of my brush into the red so I don't get that much. I'm using my medium brush right now, and I'm going to swirl those colors together. Now I'm going for a pretty deep orange color. So I'm going to take another little corner of my brush and I'm going to darken it up a little bit more. Now I'm going to take the excess of what's on my brush and I'm going to wipe it off. And I'm going to go through and add a whole scoop of white to that smaller mixture. You can see even with that small mixture of yellow, I still have a pretty bright color here. So I'm going to go ahead and rinse out my brush to get any of that excess color out because we want to lighten it a little bit more. Wipe it off on your paper towel and let's grab a little bit more white paint. That's much closer to the color that we want to use. Okay. Go ahead and rinse out your small brush. We're going to put the medium brush into your water. The bees are really, really fun. We're going to build these guys up using a series of shapes. So what I want to do to start out with is I really want to figure out the body of my bee. That's kind of step number one. So you make sure you know about how wide the top and the bottom is going to be. What's great is you can see here, both are about the width of my brush. So I don't want to use a heavy amount of paint. I still want like just a little bit with some water so that I have some nice control of my brush. But that's a great size reference for you for this really small brush. Same thing for our wings as well. You can see that's really, really, really tiny. We're going to end up building up the color a little bit more. And then, of course, all the little detail at the end. So let's go ahead and we're going to use the light yellow paint that we mixed first. So go ahead and dip your brush into the water. We want to dip it into a little bit of your light yellow mixture that we have. Remember, I like to spin my brush. You can see I'm doing it a little bit here so that I get a really nice thin shape on the very top, so it's really easy to work with. So you want to leave a little bit of space from the top of your flower, but I'm going to go ahead and start my first bumblebee up over here, which is kind of half of the canvas almost that I have left is where I'm going to start the top of my bumblebee. And I'm leaving plenty of room at the bottom for my second half. So go ahead and you're going to press and flatten your brush. That's going to give you a pretty good shape to start out with. I would just widen the sides just a little bit so you have a little bit more room. We're going to continue almost making this figure 8 pattern. I'm going to press my brush, still using that light yellow, and I'm going to widen it a little bit more on the bottom. And this time I'm really trying to keep the very bottom of my bumblebee nice and pointed. So instead of overlapping and outlining the sides, I'm really ending in the same spot when I make my final brush stroke. I'm just going to add a little bit more water to my paint, and you can see, or just to my brush. And you can see just with a little bit of that water, I can kind of push around and keep that bottom part of my bumblebee pretty translucent, but just using a little bit of water on my brush. If it gets too wet, you can always take a little piece of a paper towel too, and you can blot it off. We do want to be able to see some color on there, so that's perfect to get started. Our wings are going to connect right into this part of our body right here where that figure 8 comes together. So going ahead, same technique. We're going to go straight out from the side and press and flatten our brushes. And then instead of being pointed like we did for the bottom, we can continue to outline that shape all the way through so that the entire shape stays outlined. And that way it'll stay a little bit more rounded too. Great, I'm gonna do this step for each of my bumblebees, and then I'm gonna come back and add a little bit more of our second color to each of the ones that we make. Go ahead and rinse out your brush. And we can add in a little bit of our next color. Still use your small brush and a little bit of water. But we're going to get a little bit of that first orangey color that we mixed on our brush. And I'm going to start to paint in this bottom half of my bumblebee. Now I'm going to take just a very small amount of water and a little bit of bright red. Plain red right from your palette. Wiping a little bit of it off so I don't have too much on my brush. And then just the middle part of your bumblebee is going to get a little bit of plain red, just to darken it up a little bit. If you'd like, you can go back and forth with your original kind of honey mustard color and get a little bit more orange back in there as well. But mostly it's going to be that red in that top part of your bumblebee. Final step is to add a little bit of black for the accents on our bumblebee, as well as little arms and little flying trails. So I'm taking my clean small brush and I'm just going to pull a little bit of black paint to the side. And I really want to make sure I'm utilizing the water here, not just for a translucent effect. This time we want to make it so that the black paint is a little bit more inky. It'll be a lot smoother to work with, and it'll be a lot easier to apply those finishing touch steps to our bees. So with a little bit of that black paint on our brush, we are going to go through and add some of the details to our bumblebee. So one of the first things I want to do is I want to create a really flat edge for the very top of my bumblebee. You can see the direction that my brush is pointing is going to be really important for this part. If I paint it upwards like this, it will certainly work, but it'll be a little bit harder to control. I really like to point it in the direction that I'm going to be brushing for my final effect. After that, I'm going to go through and I'm going to add a little black triangle to really accentuate that point. I'm going to add almost like a little waistband to my bumblebee right in the middle of that figure 8. And for this, I'm going to actually blot back over my line so it looks a little messier. Now on this top part of my bumblebee, what I'd like to do is kind of create a dark center. I want to leave a little bit of yellow at the top and at the bottom though. But you can get pretty close and even touch the sides. So I'm kind of starting with this, it's like a Dorito shape. I'm going to extend it a little bit more on that right-hand side. And then we're going to add a little bit of your accents to your wings. So I'm going to go through starting in the middle and I'm going to outline the top of my wing. Really, really light pressure here. Where this is so small, it's okay if like part of your paint runs out so it's not a completely even line. I'm just going to brush a couple more lines underneath. going in that same direction and kind of out from that first line shape that I made. Perfect. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to try and make it pretty spotty. Perfect. The bumblebee is going to get 3 legs on each side, so we're going to do 1, 2. Again, if easier, you can rest your hand on either the canvas or you can rest it on the table as you're doing the step. And then about halfway down the bottom part of the bee, that's where we're going to do the next line. And let's just match it up on the other side. Now to make the fun little trailing off portions of our bee, it's almost like a little spiral is going to happen. So again, I'm using mostly the top of my brush, and I'm going to make this little dotted pattern. You can really use this to fill up any of the space that you have left. But I'm going to start by making 3 dots that come up to start my curve. And then I'm going to start to come back around. I'll curve one more time. You really shouldn't have to reload your brush too much for that little accent to finish off your bumblebee. I really got through that pretty okay with just 1 brush load of paint. I'm going to go through and I'm going to add my last little details to the other 2 bumblebees now. I'm going to rinse off my brush and go through and water down some more of that black paint. I want it to be pretty watered down this time. I'm going to blot off my brush a little bit so it's not too wet before I go in and paint. And I'll dip back into this watered down pile. Now, if you'd like, you can go through and add a couple accents to your flower stems. I'm going to go through on the left-hand side of my stems with this really watered down paint and just add a little bit more detail. Now to finish this out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up a light color for the center of this flower to really show that we're looking at the front, and then we're going to finish out our last little flowers that have not quite bloomed just yet. So I'm going to go to my medium-sized brush. Make sure you get it nice and rinsed out. And I'm going to take a scoop of white. And I'm going to take a 1/4 scoop of that yellow. And I'm going to take just a corner of my brush worth of black. It's going to give us kind of a cool yellowy green color that we're going to use for the center of our flower, and then we'll add a little bit more white paint to it to brighten it up. So go ahead and switch to your small brush and add a little bit of this color you just mixed. And I'm going to use some blotting and create a circle shape right in the middle of my flower. I really don't want this to be any bigger than the size of a nickel. You can see I got some nice texture going on here as well. This is thicker paint than what we've been using for the past couple of rounds. I'm going to wipe off my brush a little bit and grab a little bit more plain white paint. And just the very top edge, I'm going to start to blot and pull that paint about halfway down that shape that we just made. That way we start to get this white textured effect like the center of our flower. I'm going to take my small brush and rinse it out. Add a scoop of black, a big scoop of yellow, and we're going to mix that together. We're going to take this mossy green mixture. Make sure you're rolling out your brush so there's not too much paint in it. And we just want to add a little shadow right to the edge of this center of our flower. Our small brush one last time. I'm going to rinse it out. I'm going to add a big scoop of red, a big scoop of yellow, about equal amounts. And we're going to mix these two together. This is going to create a slightly more orange red than what we had to start out with. And I'm going to spin my brush to wipe off some of that excess paint. Now we just want to finish off these teardrop shapes with a couple of little triangles to represent the flowers that haven't blossomed yet. So go ahead and add the outside of those triangle shapes and then brush your paint back towards that initial green shape that we made. I'm going to take a little bit more red and just kind of accent the left side of this shape, making sure that I get those edges nice and pointed. Once you finished up that final step, you're finished with your Buzzing Blossoms painting. Congrats, you did it. That's all that I have for you for today. Thank you so much for joining us for one of our Muse to Go videos, and we hope to see you back again soon. Bye.